Next, we have Tyler Palmer. Tyler is the Director of Operations Division of the City of Moscow Public Works Department.
Okay, well, I'm really happy to be out here today. It's funny, road maintenance really is an exciting topic for me, and I never thought it would be. I don't think any of us, as we're growing up, you know, they have you color the picture when you're in kindergarten and say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I think it's inevitably a lot of things that are related to municipal work or government work. You know, it's a fireman or a policeman, but I don't think a lot of people draw a road worker or an engineer, or, you know, there's not a lot of us that do that, and I think a lot of us just fall into the field. I certainly did. I'd fully intended to go to law school. Dad was an attorney, Grandpa was an attorney, and I was in pre-law and hating it. And I actually took a seasonal position with the Public Works Department for the city I was living in. And I was out, you know, shoveling asphalt, fixing water lines, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And at the time, I had no idea why. I didn't know why I was really, really enjoying the work. But I've come to realize that what we do is the backbone of society. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that, and I think that it's really important that we remind ourselves of what we do and why we do it and why we're drawn to it. We can get so hyper-focused on the technical aspects and the specifics, but if we don't think about the cui bono question, about who benefits from what we do and why we do it, I think that we can lose sight of the value and why we feel so drawn to it. When the first of our ancestors, however many centuries ago, quit wandering around and decided, hey, you know what, we like living close to each other. It was meaningful relationships with other human beings that drove us to settle down and create cities. And the very first conversation that you had to have when you did that was, who's getting the water? Who's going to build the trail to the other village that's over by the coast so we can get fish? Who's going, you know, these basic transportation, water, sewage, those needs are the very basic needs that ultimately the reason they exist is because we want to live close to each other. And to me, there's something really beautiful about that, and I think that it's worth remembering. So that, you know, it really drew me to Public Works. I really loved it. Transportation in particular is interesting for me. When I was driving along when my daughter was young, she was about 3 years old, and I stopped at a stoplight, and she said, "Daddy, why do we stop?" And I said, "Well, honey, it's a red light, and with the lights, red means stop and green means go." And she rolls her eyes and she says, "I know that, Dad." And then with total abject disgust, she goes, "I thought you were in charge of the streets." I think sometimes our residents feel that way about us, is that, you know, they'll call up and they'll say, why are there potholes? Why are there cracks? And you try and explain, you know, all the budgets and the ramification, everything else, and I feel like I'm getting that same response from them. The rolled eyes and I know that, Tyler, but I thought you guys were in charge of the streets. And so today I'm going to talk from a local perspective about street maintenance and just some of the challenges that we have. I know there aren't a lot of local people in the room, but, you know, most of our streets are local streets. The entity that I work for, we have about 190 lane miles of streets that we try and maintain. You know, it's peanuts compared to what a lot of you do. But most of the streets in the country are local streets. Most of the budgeting towards streets are local streets. And I think that often local streets are, I guess, neglected when it comes to education, outreach, and the ability to have access to the toolbox that is available for pavement maintenance. And I think it's critically important. I think what Daryl does is super important. It's absolutely critical what the T2 centers do to try and bring this kind of training to local folks. And when I talk about education, I don't just mean the staff. I mean, things have to start with the staff. We have to have an educated staff. They have to know why they're doing what they're doing. You know, all our staff is actually plugged into the T2 Road Master and Road Scholar program in our state, and they do a really nice job of training our folks. But there's also education of our administration, because there's so many competing priorities on the local level. You know, do we want to fund, streets aren't sexy. They're just not. The politician wants to build a new park. They want to build a new building that they get a plaque with their name on. And so we have to convince them that streets are worth investing in. And on the local level, that can be very difficult because funding is terribly difficult on the local level. I know we all struggle with funding. That's what you're going to hear. The biggest challenge you ask any entity on any level, it's funding, 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 funding. But I would argue that to a large extent, the funding challenges that we have, especially with transportation, in part it's because we don't know how to deliver messages as well. We're not good at delivering the message of public works and its importance. I think that public safety can do that in a more effective way. They can talk about the critical nature of what they do, and, you know, if it's a public works priority and a police priority, and they say we need X because of Y, and public works says we need X because of Y, generally police are going to win that argument. I think we have a very compelling argument and one that really resonates with our politicians if we're able to communicate it adequately. I think one of the problems is that engineers who run our profession in street maintenance are really good at designing stuff. And they're really good at coming up with the right mixture and the right application rate, the proper emulsion. But a lot of times what makes somebody a good engineer is because they like to just go into a room and they want to solve a problem. But they're not people to grandstand. They don't want to feel like they're patting themselves on the back. They don't want to go out and have the ribbon cutting because, you know, they're just problem solvers. They like to put their head down and figure stuff out. But I would argue that that's part of the reason that we really need to get better about communicating what we do and the value of what we do. And then another big obstacle for local government that I think a lot of you in the room can help with is there's a trepidation for local governmental agencies to do anything new. Because there is no payoff for the small entity, road supervisor, public works director, whomever he may be, to put his neck out. If he does what's always been done and he continues to do what's always been done, he's safe. But he has such a limited budget that for him to go take a flyer on some new way of doing some things, you know, somebody comes in and says, hey, you know what, this isn't a good road for you to go and do a mill and fill, you know, you should be considering something different. He's not going to do that because he doesn't know what it is and he doesn't have the chance to fail. He doesn't have the chance to take a flyer on something. And so that becomes a real problem is even if they're educated about what it is and they're told what it is, it's a gee whiz technology that they're doing somewhere else in the big city, but I know that this works, and so I'm going to stick with doing this. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've done in the city of Moscow. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Moscow. Moscow is about 5.5 hours from here. We're the home of the University of Idaho. We've got Washington State University in Pullman directly across the border. We're pretty geographically isolated. We have no freeway. The closest freeway is I-90 that goes through Spokane, about 90 minutes to the north of us. We don't have, you know, any sort of big access, and the closest city to us is Spokane, which is relatively small by comparison. And so access can be a real problem for us. And so we really, when I came to the city of Moscow, we had what we called the overlay program. The program was just called the overlay program. And what we call things matters. It really does. You know, one of the things that absolutely drives me crazy in public works is we'll name things the technical name rather than naming them what they do. And so you'll call something the 2012 slurry seal project. Who's that for? You know, when we name something, we're giving it a title. We should consider the audience for the title. We do that really bad with public works in general. We'll name projects the technical aspect, but all of us who are dealing with it, we know the technical aspect of it. We should name the project what it does. Call it something that the public can interact with and they understand, so that when that pops up on the city's website or the flyer shows up on their door, it's not some confusing technical jargon, some nomenclature with which they're not familiar. You know, it's way better. Call something, pavement longevity project, or even pavement preservation project, ride quality improvement project, things that people can relate to and that they understand. The program was called the overlay program, and the reason it was called the overlay program is because that's all they did, is just overlays. Overlay, 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 just fill it in until the curb was absolutely full and there was no curb reveal left, and then you went through and you tore it out eventually and started over. And that's what it was called, because that's all that we did. It got $200,000 a year, and that's all it had been funded at for decades, was $200,000 a year, and that was the overlay program. And it was left to the streets folks to figure out how to use it appropriately, and keep the roads up, and have the roads be upkept. Well, the big problem with that is that there wasn't any sort of quantitative measure for the roads. You know, they were just conducting a windshield survey. And there's nothing wrong with a windshield survey. You know, a lot of people can go out and you can find out a lot about a street. But when you don't have an objective way to quantify what the issue is, then the employee becomes the problem. So when the streets are bad and the process is so-and-so goes and does a windshield survey and they decide where to spend this $200,000 that we have in this overlay program, then the problem isn't that it's underfunded or that the right techniques aren't being used. The problem is that street supervisor. Hey, why aren't the streets getting fixed? You know, you're going out and looking at them. Haven't you seen how bad this street is? We gave you some money. What's going on? And his only answer is, oh, well, I don't have enough money to do all of them that I want to do. But there was really no quantification of it. And this is still a problem. We wouldn't like to think so, but throughout the country, especially with smaller cities, you'd be amazed how many of them don't have a formalized program for just inspecting the streets, giving them an overall condition index rating, and structuring a plan. It's still done with a windshield survey. Drive around, take the little pittance of money that we have, and chase our tail. But it's easy to see how we got there. This is the actual historic asphalt costs for the city of Moscow, and the specific numbers don't matter, and I know you can't see the scale on there, but there was a time back when asphalt got so cheap that doing an overlay was pretty inexpensive. It wasn't really a dumb move for most streets because it was really, really inexpensive to have to buy the asphalt and do the overlay, and it was locally available. There were contractors that knew how to deal with asphalt. And in the kind of quantities that we're putting out, we don't have the quantities of scale that we can offset the mobilization to have some company come in from Seattle or Salt Lake or somewhere else to do these services for us. And so it makes sense that it was the only tool in the toolbox because it was the only tool available. But then as asphalt costs start to really spike, it became all the more imperative that we figure out how to do appropriate pavement management. So one of the things that we did really early on is we established the Inland Northwest Street Maintenance Co-op. There are a lot of groups around, but what we needed was a hyper-local group, and really the goal of this organization was so that we could pool resources with other local entities so that we could try to offset those problems with economy of scale that we'd have. So rather than having, one entity that's trying to put out a 200,000 yard slurry seal package and is getting quotes through the roof on it, we have 3 entities that put out a package at the same time with the same spec in the same area, and all of a sudden we've got 1 million square yards, and it gets far more attractive. And so we meet twice a year. It's pretty informal. We get together twice a year. We generally have some sort of technical presentation, but more than anything, we try and coordinate projects. The enthusiasm for participation in this really shocked us. We ended up very quickly, we have now 32 member entities all around the Inland Northwest, Coeur d'Alene, Lewiston, Moscow, Pullman, both universities, Washington State University, University of Idaho. But the really encouraging thing is the small towns are the ones that really benefit from this. Because when Moscow and Lewiston and Pullman get together and we put out an AR chip package, that is a process that would never be available to some of these small entities. They would never, ever be able to put out the square yardage, even a slurry package or something like that. But when we put out the quantity, they're able to piggyback on these bids, and so they get access to things that they just never had access to before. And so it's really gratifying and encouraging to see them get the access. And so it's been a really successful process that we've engaged in, and we've been really happy with the results of that. Through the co-op, we'd worked, we developed specifications. Generally, the large cities would develop the specifications in concert, and then we'd make those available to the small entities. We've got a meeting actually coordinated with our T2 Center. We're going to do it in conjunction with them this fall. And it's been neat to see because some of the big, I call it a bigger city just because we are the bigger city in the area, we can take the risks that the small entities can't. And so, the city of Moscow did its first slurry seal. We brought the first slurry seal to the area. Just overlays had been done in the whole region forever back in 2011. And it took a few years for everyone to see it and see that it worked and see that it held up, and they'd come and tour and everything else. Lewiston got on board. They were the first one 2 years later that got on board with us. We put out an AR chip a couple years later. This year, we've got 5 different entities that are putting out a slurry seal together. And so it went from just 1 to now we've got 5 that are comfortable with it, and 2 of them are smaller entities. And so they really are catching on. When we do these projects, we really try and focus on turning these into educational things that we can help our elected officials understand the importance of what we do. So, for example, when we did this AR chip project, we held, through the co-op, we organized a show and tell day. And we had food, and we had a table set up, and we had refreshments, and we had a bunch of local politicians, local street folk that all came out. The contractor was there to help explain the process, and they were able to actually watch this process happen. So they stood out on a street corner, they watched the process happen. It was a real day of pride. Our elected officials felt an immense amount of pride because the city of Moscow was innovating. They were doing the first time this had ever been done in the area, and so our electeds that were there felt great because there they are rubbing shoulders with their neighboring elected officials, and they felt pride that the Moscow was the one doing this. But then all of these other politicians go back and they see the value of the road work. They see what's happening. And so road work starts to become something that we talk about, and it can be a sense of pride, that they realize the value to the community in having good roads and what that costs. And then as we go through the process and we make this an objective thing where we have good numbers, every 3 years we update our OCIs. We have one of the video outfits that comes out and does the van work and updates our OCI. The nice thing is we're able to remove ourselves from being the problem. So we're not in between. We don't make ourselves the problem, because it becomes a very easy conversation to have when you talk about road work, when you have the good data, because then you just sit down and say, okay, You guys think the roads suck. I think they suck too. Here's how much it'll cost to have them suck less. Here's how much it'll cost to have them suck even a little bit less. If we continue at this rate, they're going to suck more, and this is how quickly they're going to suck more. It's a really easy thing to just show. And so, you know, it's one of those things that they're really drawn to these solutions for streets because a lot of the other things they have to deal with, they can throw money at it, but they're really not sure it's going to have an impact. But if they trust us, if we've developed that confidence, and we've shown them that, look, $1 in us is $1 well invested, and if I tell you, I can show you the numbers. If you give me X amount, you're going to get this result. These are the results that you will get. It becomes very attractive because it's a very achievable goal. It's a problem that they can wrap their head around, and it's a problem that they know, if I put this money invested in this, I'm going to get this outcome. And that's been super, super beneficial. The end result for us, these are our budget numbers that we've seen in what was called the overlay program that is now the pavement management program. As you can see, it has skyrocketed in the last 3 years. For the we were over $1 million in the upcoming budget that'll go active in October. And that doesn't seem like a lot for a lot of entities, but we're a relatively small city, and this is just the pavement management portion. Our calculations are that they've got to get us to about $1.5 million in the surface treatment program in order for us to be able to get on the 7-year rotation that we'd like to be on. So we want to be on a 7-year rotation, and that's what we need to get there. In a very short amount of time, we've shot up from a $200,000 average to over $1 million. And that is just purely the result of messaging and prioritizing. They're looking at it and they're saying, yeah, this is something that's worth investing in, and they can wrap their head around why it's worth investing in because we've answered the cui bono question. I think a lot of times when we talk to the politicians about things like street maintenance, it's something that's easy to equate to other maintenance procedures. When we do our presentation with new incoming council people, what we always equate it to is doing the oil change in a car versus replacing the engine. It's something they understand. It's something they can wrap their head around. So we say, look, here are your choices. This is why we're doing the good roads first. This is why you are going to get phone calls from constituents saying, hey, why did they get a brand new street a block over when their street was already nice and my street's falling apart and you didn't do anything with it for years? It's a really easy thing for them to understand. Say, look, it's not a new street. People perceive it to be that, but here's what's going on. And then we also have a pretty aggressive social media outreach campaign that we try and inject humor into our processes. We've had a lot of fun with it. But the community has really started to understand why we're doing what we're doing. And so every year we've had a decrease in phone calls from the residents because they get it. And they understand why their road is in the condition that it's in. Now, obviously not all of them, but by and large, just that education component has been highly impactful for us and has been really helpful. And then just cooperation with industry folks, you know, just staying in touch with the people that are doing the work, staying abreast of things that are going on. And then, you know, the last thing I'll touch on just briefly is that there's a lot of talk about the need to come up with a different funding mechanism at the local level, well, at all levels, but especially the local level for transportation funding. We really try and stay abreast of those conversations as we have more electric vehicles coming on the road. You know, the gas tax has never been pegged to inflation in the state of Idaho. It hadn't been raised in a couple decades, and a few years ago we got them to raise it, but only half of what we'd asked for, and they still didn't peg it to inflation. So we're falling behind, and it's inevitable that we'll have to find another funding mechanism. And I think that's another really important thing that we all talk about in our industry is just not the technical side, but really talk about that funding side, because there is a funding crisis with road maintenance that we're all going to have to grapple with really quickly, especially as you look at the projection for electric vehicles and what's going to be happening with that. And so we really got to deal with those things. Well, I'll take questions then if anyone has any questions.
John Copeland, Authority DOT. Your graph shows that you've been blessed with some money. Where did they take it from?
What really happened was there were a lot of little pockets that this stuff would end up in that, you know, for example, they would be really quick to, from the general fund, from unanticipated fund balance, that'd generally get swept into things like, you know, new project stuff. It'd get swept into new projects. And what we've really tried to emphasize is from an asset management standpoint, even though it's really fun to build the new, we can't build the new if we can't maintain what we have. And so by and large, it's been a matter of convincing them that, yeah, capital projects are fun and sexy, but maintenance is more important. That it's irresponsible for us to divert money into new stuff if we're not maintaining the stuff that we have, which is such, it seems silly that you even have to say it because it's such a common sense thing. But when nobody's saying that, when the city council sits down and sets their goals, the new and the shiny is always what comes first. And so our council has really adopted a very responsible approach. And so by and large, it's come from what would have otherwise been capital funding for new projects. All right, well, thank you, appreciate it.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.